Hi, everybody. I'm Tony Gale. I'm a Sony Artisan of Imagery. Sony's sponsoring this talk. I'm going to go over location portraiture. And as we go along, I say this every time anything is going to live on the internet, because I know how the internet is. It's okay if you disagree with me. Photography is subjective. If you think some other way is better, that's fine. There probably is a better way for everything. Everything could be better. Everything could be different. This is just how I do things. All right. I am also, in addition to being a Sony Artisan of Imagery, a Manfrotto Ambassador, an X-Rite Colorati, and the National President of APA, the American Photographic Artists. Partly I bring that up just so that if I mention any of those things, you guys know. So you're like, he didn't say. All right. And then, for those of you who are women, I'm bringing this up because Sony has this very cool creator in residence program called Alpha Female for women photographers. They just extended the deadline into September. It's free to apply, and you send them information about a project you're doing, and if you win, I think there's 6 people that win, you get a mentor, which is one of the women Sony Artisans, and a bunch of gear so you can work on your project, and I think maybe some cash. It's cool. It's very cool. There should be more women in photography than there are, so I think it's a great thing. You can find out more. That's why I did the drop-down, alphauniverse.com. If you click on Be Alpha, there's more information there. And I encourage anyone who is a woman and can apply to apply. Even if you think your shot is minimal, so what? You never know. All right. This, to start with, is just a quick sample of some of my work because some of you may know who I am and some of you don't, and you're always wondering who is this person talking and do they know what they're talking about? Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. All right, so location portraiture. This is an example of some of what I bring, depending on the shoot. My A7R3s, a bunch of lenses, 100 to 400, 24 GM, 2470, 85 1.8. Sony Speedlight with a battery pack just in case, a bunch of cards. The little silver camera is infrared. It doesn't get used a lot, but it's really fun when I use it. The iPad is because if I am shooting with a client, so if you're my client and you hire me to photograph this guy, you want to see what I'm doing. So I can set up the iPad so every shot I take sends a JPEG to that iPad so that you can see what's happening and you can say, yeah, we got it. So I use that a lot if I'm shooting commercially in a situation where tethering directly to a computer doesn't make sense. This is roughly what we're going to go over. Location versus studio, environmental portraiture, location lighting, finding location, and permitting. I'm sure that there will be things that I don't cover that you wish I did, so please ask questions at the end. And then maybe next time I'll include them. So what is portraiture? This is something that I promise you, if anybody's watching live right now, somebody's screaming at their computer because they're going to disagree with what I say. To me, portraiture is a picture of a person where the person is the reason for the picture. Does that make sense? Like fashion, the person is not the reason for the picture. Whatever thing they have is the reason for the picture. A portrait is, I'm photographing you or you because I need a picture of you. That's the simple answer. So the same picture could be fashion or portraiture depending on the motivation behind it. And then you get into things like fashion portraiture where the line gets even blurrier. But that's what a portrait is to me. Somebody somewhere probably has a different definition and they're screaming right now. If this was on YouTube, it would be in the comments. That guy doesn't know what he's talking about. So these are just some examples of studio portraits as opposed to location portraits. That main difference to me, in case it's not obvious, is if you are in an enclosed space that you control completely, that's a studio. It doesn't have to be an official photo studio. It could be your living room. It could be your kitchen. It could be this space if we turn off all the lights. It's not necessarily I went and rented a photo studio. I know a bunch of people have studios in their garages. If you take out the studio part and you don't control everything, then it's a location. If you do, studio. I've set up studios in hotel rooms and in apartments. So that's all studio portraits. Everything was controlled. All the lighting is controlled. The background is controlled by bringing in a background, an artificial background. Now, with location, that changes. I may control all the lighting, but I'm not controlling every element in the same way. This, for example, is at Beecher's Cheese Shop. This was for an editorial shoot. He's an actor. I don't remember his name, but he was very, very nice. And this is a location shoot because we're obviously in a location. The light's behind the bar. The whole point of this is to get a sense of place. That's part of why you would shoot on location, is it can be more interesting than a white wall or a black wall or a gray wall. These are in California, using flare to make it more interesting. Partly because to me this looks like it was shot in California, right? It's all warm and sunny, and if you're going to shoot somewhere on location, there needs to be a reason for it. Like, you don't want to shoot on location. Well, you might for a job, but you're typically not going to shoot on location in New York and try and pretend that you shot it in LA or Chicago, right? You want to be enjoying the fact that you're in New York and shoot something that looks like it's New York, typically. Unless the client says, can you pretend this was shot in LA? And then, you know, it's your job to do whatever the client wants. My former office rooftop. I felt like this seemed pretty New York, right? Empire State Building, water tower. The old Los Angeles Zoo. Has anybody been to the old Los Angeles Zoo in LA? If you ever go to LA and you're looking for a location, LA can be a little tricky with what you're allowed to shoot in public places. Just be careful with that. We'll talk about permits later. But it's awesome. It closed in like the 60s. My dad grew up in LA. And I said, oh, I was at the old Los Angeles Zoo. And he's like, what's that? And I told him, and he's like, you mean the zoo? Because when he grew up there, that was the zoo. It's a little depressing if you think of it as a zoo, because it's really, all the things are really small. But there's like 5 of these habitats that are still there. And it's just a cool, fun spot. This was at the launch of the Sony 85 1.8 lens. Can anybody guess where this is? Yep, Central Park, yep. You can't go wrong there. The light is beautiful. Well, you can go wrong. You can go at the wrong time of day when there's 9,000 people there. And you can't see anything because there's too many people. But if you go at the right time of day, when there aren't 9,000 people, it's a beautiful spot. And it's with the roof, you get the light coming in from the side. It's beautiful light. It looks great. This is in Central Park. It's near the Bethesda Fountain. So it's kind of near the lake. There's a little overpass. There's the big stairs going down. You've seen, I don't have any of it because I've seen it so many times I don't shoot it, but there's the shot of like people going up or down the stairs backlit with the arches. And it's a really pretty spot.
Close to the east side on 70th Street.
Yeah, if you just look for Bethesda Fountain, you'll find it. This I shot last week at Sony's condo event. Does anybody know about Sony's condo event? Next time.
Is it on video?
So far, they've done 3 of them. The first one was just Sony Artisans and Collective and Press and people like that. Last year and this year, the public could apply to go. You have to pay, but frankly, I think if you like photography, I think it was around $2,200 maybe, but it includes lodging, it includes food, it includes being able to borrow anything you can think of that Sony has. They have the 600 f4. 600 2.8, 600 f4, 400 2.8. They had 150 of the A7R4s that aren't out yet. So this was shot with the A7R4. I had to give it back though. It was very sad. But mine's pre-ordered. I should be at the top of the list. That's a perk of being an artist, and they at least put you at the top of the list. So this was shot in Oregon, Sun River, Oregon at Condo. And there's models you can check out. I can go up and say, hi, what models are available? Oh, these 3, OK. Usually I just say, whoever's ready now is great. I'll take that person. You can borrow lights. It's really a cool event. If anybody's curious, we can talk about it more. They're already talking about Condo 4.0. So I expect it to happen probably next summer. But I don't know anything definitively. They say it's happening, so I believe it. It is a really cool event. All right, so that was all just location portraiture. The locations were part of it, but the locations weren't necessarily critical to the storytelling. Environmental portraiture is more portraiture where the location, where the setting is part of the picture and relates to the person in some way. This was actually for catalog, but I put it in there. He's got his whistle. He's got his basketball. There's a basketball hoop in the background. So it makes sense. It tells the story. He's a basketball coach, right, with the basketball hoop. If he were wearing, I don't know, cargo shorts, and a hoodie and standing there, then it's just a location portrait because the location isn't relevant to him personally. Does that make sense? And if anybody's curious, this was 3 lights and it was shot at like 5 in the afternoon. It was just, everything was too busy back there, so I blasted it so everything went dark, so it felt more moody and was less distracting. This is a professor named John Bove who was at Cooper Union for, I think, like 46 years. And he'd been in this office like 42 years. This is the building they tore down, that they sold and tore down. It is now a big office building. And he retired a few years later. He was chair of the chemistry program. But for him, this picture is not the same without that office, right? His environment tells the story. You look at this and you think this feels like a college professor that's been in that office since the dawn of time. Yeah, he was very, very nice, although he was surprised when I showed up because he forgot I was coming. Which just lends itself to the college professor idea, right? Especially a science professor.
Absolutely. You were not at the high end.
Yeah. But he was super nice, and I really like this picture. This, I don't remember everybody's name, so if you happen to be one of these people watching and I don't remember your name, I'm sorry. This gentleman, so that one and this one was for a personal project I have that's interesting people, where anyone could suggest anybody that they think is interesting for any reason, and then they just say why they're interesting, and then I photograph them in some way that makes context. This gentleman was a Paralympian. He played sled hockey and was in charge of, he worked for the New York City Parks in charge of accessibility. So we photographed him in his wheelchair in this little park on the Upper West Side. And again, because works for the parks, in charge of accessibility, wheelchair, little park, it helps tell the story. Some random person in the park, it's no longer environmental, it's just a picture. Although I promise you that's something that somebody is arguing with me right now about too. This also for the same project, this woman is a collector of things and an organizer of things. So when I did it, I wanted it to feel like things were organized, but there was just a lot of stuff. So we had her take out all these trays of things. She was suggested by a friend who was friends with her daughter and said in school when they had to do a project, they'd go to her and be like, we need blue beads. OK, no problem. Here's 20 different sizes. What do you need? She creates art with zippers. This is the mayor of Fort Worth, Texas. And this is in front of City Hall with an art piece that is famous in Fort Worth. So with her, it was a little tricky because municipal buildings aren't always that attractive. So we were looking for places to shoot. She talked about the sculpture. I don't want to show too much of the sculpture because then you get into, I'm not a lawyer, but you want to be careful showing art because art is copyrighted. So this is just a piece of it, and it gives a sense of the area, and it feels lively and fun. And she was quite fun and lively. She was very nice. Has anybody been to Salvation Mountain near the Salton Sea? We just talked about the Salton Sea. So there's this mountain made out of hay bales mostly that this guy built called Salvation Mountain. He died a few years ago. But it's quite famous if you go to the Salton Sea. It's this crazy art project. It's always in danger of falling down unless it's maintained because it's hay bales and stucco and paint. But when I was there, I asked him if I could take his picture, and he said sure. And then I said, what's your favorite part of this? And this was his favorite part. So that's why I photographed him there. He was quite a character. Can anybody guess what he does? Yes, he builds furniture out of wood, out of found wood. So again, that's the point of the environmental portrait. You could tell what he did because of the context. If I put him in that little park where the other guy was, then it's just a guy in a park. Might be a great picture, might be a terrible picture, who knows? But it doesn't have context. It doesn't tell the story. This one's pretty obvious. Cops in front of a police car. Although this was actually for a catalog, so. Which is why we had to retouch the city off of the police car. Again, context, firefighters. Any guesses? She was a curator for an art gallery in Seattle, the Photographic Center Northwest. If you ever go to Seattle, it's worth checking out. It's a school, and they have a gallery. Pulitzer Prize-winning author and his agent in front of her wall of books, which I love. I want that many books. I want space for that many books, too. This is Keith Gentile, who owns Agency Access, in his office in front of this chalkboard thing he has. But it feels like an office to me, right? Maybe not. It does to me, not to her. Ah, see, so maybe it's not environmental enough. Oh, this one should not be in this section. This was for an editorial shoot. And the reason I put this here, but it's in the wrong spot, is to show context. So that's a closet in an apartment that was for sale, that was our location. I was doing video interviews with everyone I photographed. This is for the Power Women issue of New York Moves a few years ago. And then while I was doing the video, that's why it's in the closet with the black background, with the constant source lights. These are Manfrotto 1x1 LEDs, which are basically the same as these light panel 1x1s. It's the same company. She was so lively that I decided to do a picture too, instead of just the video. Because, I mean, look at that. She's so expressive. It was awesome. This is Robin Quivers, who was a co-host. I don't know if she still is. Does anybody listen to Howard Stern?
No, but I know the name. And,
She used to be a co-host with Howard Stern. I don't know if she still is. But she was very nice. Mayor of Baltimore. That feels like a pretty impressive city hall, right? Writer in Brooklyn. She feels like a quirky writer in Brooklyn to me. At least a quirky person in Brooklyn. We had to move a lot of things to do this picture because it's a New York City apartment. I imagine most of you live in New York, right? And nobody's apartment is huge, and there's just stuff everywhere because it's New York. So behind us in the kitchen, there's a whole bunch of stuff we moved. And then those books on the right are there in part to hide, you can sort of see the power strip coming out, but just to hide all the power cables and things. So when you're shooting on location too, don't be afraid to move stuff. Although if it's really expensive or fragile, make someone else move it. If it's an art piece or something, whoever I'm photographing, I'm like, hey, would you mind moving this? I don't want to be the one that's scratched there, even if it's not expensive. You know, if it's art, somebody loved it. But if it looks fragile or rickety, someone else can move it. But think about that. Just think about moving all that stuff. And then, since we talked about blending strobes with daylight, part of this exposure was making sure that the window didn't go too dark because it was a cloudy day. We'll get more into that, but that's also something to think about. If you look at that shot, if that window was blown out or black, it's a very different shot, right? This window, you kind of don't notice. Like, it's there, it's part of it, but it's not, it doesn't draw attention to itself, really, which was the goal, because I want the attention to go to her. This is at a bar in Las Vegas. He does marketing for all the restaurants at Caesars. And this, it's all available light. That light hitting him is coming from the fire mostly. And then in the foreground, those reflections are just a glass table that's super out of focus that I came in right on time. Partly because it felt like there was too much, the legs of the chairs were too much without putting something in front of them. Don't be afraid to hide things. Just flipping through. He also works at Caesars. Like, that feels like somebody who works in Las Vegas, right? Since it's Las Vegas. All right. Now we're going to get into more technical stuff. Everybody good so far? All right. So this shot, I'm going to go back and forth. This shot is this. Obviously not the same frame. It's two lights. They're both speed lights, Sony speed lights with radios. In Lastalite EasyBox Speedlight 2s, which are little soft boxes about this big that'll mount on the speedlight with grids. You can see the grid on the back. The one on the top, the main one there, is being held with a super clamp and a magic arm to the side of the building. Super clamp is just a clamp that'll attach to anything. A magic arm is this flippy thing that you can adjust to any angle and then just lock it. And then I have an assistant with a pole with the other one so I can have her adjust it as needed. Part of the advantage of the magic arm and the super clamp in New York, and again, we'll get into more of this. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so this may not technically be the spirit of the law. But in New York, you need a permit if you put a light stand on the ground. If you don't put a light stand on the ground, you don't need a permit. If somebody stops you, this is my interpretation, I'm not a lawyer. So a lot of people will just have assistants hold lights. It's a $300 application fee for a permit in New York. It used to be way better. There was a period of time when you could download a PDF, fill it out, fax it to them, back when people had faxes. If you got it in by 3 o'clock, they'd fax it back to you the same day. There was no fee for anything. It was fantastic. If, for each shoot in New York, if you need a permit, if it's part of the same project, and we'll repeat this and get into it, you can do a permit for multiple shoots. There's more to it that we'll talk about in a little bit. But part of the way I avoid it, I have an assistant holding a light, and the other light is not on the ground. It's attached to the building. So you got that nice rim light from this one in the back, and then the other light filling in. Everything's nice and blurry, so the background feels like it's a place, but it's not too distracting, because New York can be pretty distracting, especially since every block has scaffolding now. Just make it out of focus. You can't tell. All right. This was also shot at Condo last week. So it's this shot. So we're in deep shade. I'm using a Stella CLX8 LED, which is a very, very powerful LED light with a little Rotolux Octabox. And I have somebody here just holding the stand. Because where she is standing, you can tell she's a little higher than me. She's on a little hill. And I couldn't get the light stand high enough without somebody holding it. So they had somebody with every shoot. When you checked out a model, they sent somebody with the model just to make sure everything was fine, if there were issues or something. And I'm like, I don't know if we can shoot here. The light's not high enough. And the model, her name is Ro, said, oh, I bet she'll hold the light. She's probably bored. She's like, sure. I'm like, OK, great. But with that shade, I was able to use a constant source light so I can see what it's doing. It's dimmable. It's really quite a nice light. And then you end up with this. Here, that's for this one. Some of my example photos are not my favorite photos in the world. They're fine. But they're not my favorite photos in the world. But I keep meaning to do more behind-the-scenes lighting than I do. So I looked for what I could find. So here you can see there's a super clamp attached to the Williamsburg Bridge. And then the magic arm, and then the speed light, and the EasyBox speed light. Two little softbox again. And then just coming in tight so you don't see my camera bag on the ground or the trash can. Not that those aren't attractive. I mean, it does tell the New York City story. A trash can does say this is New York. The only thing better would be the pile of trash bags. That was one of the weirdest. I've been here 19 years. It took me like a year to get used to every couple days seeing a 6-foot pile of trash bags on the street. And in the summer, you just can't get used to it with that smell.
What's the penalty for a notification of $300, but what's the penalty for using the rights if you get caught up?
Do I know what the penalty is if you don't have a permit and you get caught? I don't. I've never gotten into trouble, so I can't say it for sure. The people I know who have were just told they had to stop.
Okay.
Again, I'm not a lawyer, so it probably depends on the situation. For example, you cannot use, if you put a light stand on a subway platform, they're a lot more likely to cause you a lot of hassle than they are if you put a light stand on the street and tell you you have to move. Because on a subway platform, they don't want you to put a light stand there because somebody could trip and fall into the tracks. Like, that's reasonable. Don't do things there. Someone might die. That's good advice for life, I think. But I have known people who were just told they had to move along using lights on the street. It just depends. You know, everybody's tolerance is different. It's also, if you're shooting for a client, that's a chance you can't take.
That's right.
If you're shooting for yourself, you just have to decide. This isn't advice. I'm not suggesting that anyone not follow the rules, to be clear. I don't want the city coming after me. But, you know, you just decide what makes sense. But the old days when it was easy and all you had to do was send them a form and they said, OK, was a lot better. Yes?
Have they ever given you trouble with using the clamp and the light on the buildings? Or
Have they ever given me trouble for using the clamp on buildings and things? No, I have never gotten into trouble for that, which is why I'm going to choose to believe that it is allowed until I learn otherwise. And I will say I was doing a photo walk at the Photo Expo a few years ago, maybe last year or the year before, with speed lights, capturing action with Sony speed lights. It was a nice photo walk. And I had clamped a light to this gate on this fence on the West Side Highway. A car pulled up, opened the gate, pulled in, and left, and I realized that it was an unmarked police car. But he didn't say anything. He just pulled in, opened the gate, ignored that my light was on it, parked his car, closed the gate, moved on. So I'm going to choose to believe that that means it's OK. I will say that you can be 100% right with some of this. It doesn't mean that you won't get hassled. And then you have to decide, like every few years, somebody will get hassled for using a tripod in Central Park. You're allowed to use a tripod in Central Park. Explicitly, you're allowed to do that. But somebody will get in trouble. And if they make a big enough fuss, then it becomes a thing and it gets into the news. And then the city says, no, no, you're allowed to do that. They shouldn't have hassled you. And then like 4 years later, it happens again. But that's city property specifically. So again, like with the subway, which is state property because it's the MTA. You can't use a tripod on MTA property, which is also MTA property. Yeah, because that's MTA.
But they allow permit, so it's like
Right. I actually have a screenshot of the permit thing for Grand Central. I'm going to speak to that right there because it's actually surprisingly easy. They're actually pretty good about it. So this single light, mixing the daylight, gives me that. Tony Harp, the mayor of New Haven, Connecticut. My behind the scenes and the after shot aren't the same angle, but you'll have to believe me that it's the same light. So this is a 500 watt monolight. It's a Bowens XMT, which possibly B&H still has super cheap because Bowens closed and then got bought by somebody else and is back. But this light was like $2,000 originally, and unless B&H is sold out on them, they were selling these for $800. I had two and I bought two more because it was such a good deal. But I don't know, they may have cleared them out. If not, it's worth considering. They're good lights. With a Last-to-Light softbox. So that's the mayor, that's a cop. When you photograph mayors, which I've done like 9 now, nobody asks you for a permit.
Yeah, I was going to say that. And you have a lot of assistants.
You know, I didn't have a, yeah. Some of these mayors had 2 or 3 cops with them. It's funny, you can just set up wherever you want. It's amazing. She was very nice. That's the shot I prefer, facing the other direction. I asked her what her favorite thing in downtown was, and those 2 churches are super old, so she's like, I really like those. So we're like, okay, we'll shoot that direction. But you can see that light coming in adds a lot of direction. It really separates her from the background. Available light is fine sometimes, but a lot of times the shot's really going to benefit by controlling the light in some way. I'm a big fan of adding light. You can do reflectors, you can do things like that. But natural existing light is rarely good. I mean, even here, so we've got this light coming right on me. That light's probably pretty good. But if I come over here, I'm guessing it's not so good.
More dramatic.
Well, and maybe dramatic is good. It depends on what you're trying to do. There's no one right answer to anything. There are photographers, successful photographers, whose entire career is available light, natural light. That scares me because if somebody hires me to shoot something and we go there and it's a thunderstorm and it's super dark, or the background we want is good, but that means that the light is terrible, I have to be able to solve that problem. And if you're using strobe outside, there was a question earlier about what kind of neutral density you might need. If you're shooting in full daylight, and there's a couple later, you probably will need neutral density unless you want to shoot at f16 or f22. Does everybody know the Sony 16 rule? So Sony 16, for those who don't, it's an old film shortcut when you were shooting with that, Hasselblad 500 CM that didn't have a meter. f16, 1/25th of a second, ISO 100 in full daylight. And then you can extrapolate from there. But with that, if you're shooting in full daylight at 100 ISO, and you want to be at the sync speed of your camera or below, which is typically 2/50th, so now you're at f11, just to match the daylight, you're going to be at f11, which is a lot of depth of field most of the time. And then if you want to overpower the daylight, you're going to be at 22 or 32 if your lens will do 32, which most 35 millimeter base cameras won't. 32 is pretty stopped down. So then to get a shallower depth of field, you can add neutral density to your camera. So now maybe you're at 5.6, and then if your light has the power, you can just boost the power. Does that make sense? And then in this situation, let's say that you wish that background was brighter. All you have to do is increase your shutter speed, or decrease your shutter speed to let more light in, because the shutter speed won't impact the strobe at all. F-stop, ISO or ISO, depending on who you are. I'm still not convinced that it's ISO. Will affect any light, right? The daylight and the strobe, but shutter will only affect the strobe because the flash duration is so fast. Does that make sense to everybody? Some people have to see it, which is fine. It can be a tricky thing. My former rooftop again. So for this is 3 speed lights. If I can, although you really don't have control over it, a cloudy day is the best if you're shooting outside with strobes, because then you don't need the neutral density. This is 3 lights. There's one on the right, you can see it. There's one mounted on the railing. You can sort of see it in the middle, above and to the left of her. And then there's the third one down the stairs, doing a tiny bit of rim light.
Where is that?
Where is this geographically?
Yeah.
This is on 25th Street between 6th and 7th.
Okay, that's just like Peter's studio.
He's around there, isn't he?
27? 26?
Yeah, so a block away.
Yeah.
This is 25th. This is where my office was until they wanted to triple the rent. But this office was great because we were on the 12th floor and I could take this, just walk up one flight to the roof, and even though it said there was an alarm, there wasn't. So you could shoot up there all the time. It was also great when we first moved in, half the building was empty, and the super would just let me go to an empty floor and shoot. Get all that nice daylight coming in from those big windows. It's great. And then they started renting it out. It was so rude. I mean, it's like they didn't care about me at all. Well, you're right. They didn't care. And, you know, however much they're getting per floor, I get it. This is Muriel Bowser, another mayor, the mayor of Washington, D.C., which has only had a mayor since like 1980 or something. Isn't that crazy? 1965, D.C. didn't have a mayor. It was 70s or like 1980 that they first had mayors. This is City Hall, but you'll notice it's very modern on the left and very old on the right. They added onto an old building to do this. The other side, you can see it, but this is, yeah, you can see the ceiling up there. It's covered. Huh. So this gentleman says in DC you have to leave the facade, but you can add on around it. That would explain why they did it that way. I didn't know that. So this is the final shot. It is a 7-foot umbrella with a single strobe, and then bleeding in the daylight so it doesn't go too dark. Now we're into full sun. So if you're in full sun like this, in a perfect world, which it is not, you have enough assistance that you can have somebody holding that scrim. That's a Elastilite scrim. So what that's doing is it's diffusing the sunlight falling directly on them. You can see the shadow of it on the ground, which then makes it so that my light, which is, I think this was a 1200 watt Elinchrom Ranger at the time, has enough power to really overpower the sun where they are directly without having to go to 22 or whatever. So it's a much easier way to control the light than it is to try and just blast out full sun. Full sun is bright. And there's very few lights, especially modified, that are bright enough. 500 watts lights, which is mostly what the battery-powered things are not bright enough with a big modifier to blast out the full sun. But if you just put that diffuser over, as you can see, problem solved. And then we actually cropped it so that you didn't see the shadow.
Is that Governor Glen?
No, this is up in Connecticut. Up in Connecticut for a catalog, which is why they're wearing college-looking things. And then another similar one. So you can see the lights coming in from the left. We've got the scrim on the right. this one, like normally you want to hide the fact that you see that shadow like we did here. That shadow's a giveaway. It's not, so we did crop it out. Here I just came in tighter so you don't see it. And there you go. So everything blends in. The light on them is nice. You don't have to hit it so hard that it overwhelms the sun. If you do that too, it's harder to control the background because you really have to get the background dark if you're overwhelming the sun in full sun, unless you add a scrim. And if you're by yourself with a small light, you can do it. If you're not holding the light, there are scrims you can hold if you're tight. If you're doing like a headshot, it gets tricky when you're doing full body or most of a body. Make sense? And then this, there's my assistant, although I think she shoots now. She's very nice. In front of this asphalt plant. And all we did with this is that I did a few frames without her, and the camera was on a tripod so that I could just remove it and blend it in. So strobe, diffusion, tripod. That's a good trick, especially if you're shooting wide shots with a light. If you lock your camera down, you can just shoot a plate without the light, and it's easy to just get it in there. Nobody has to know. I won't tell, probably. But you can see it makes it a lot easier, especially we needed that wide shot. We needed space on the right for copy. But the sun was coming from there, so the scrim had to be there. I mean, the other alternative is that's a 3x6. You could get a 20x20, like 8,000 sandbags, some junior rollers, put a scrim up like 20 feet in the air. Although actually, even that probably wouldn't work because one of those corners would still be in there. So this is the easiest way to fix it. And you do see this a lot when people are shooting outside on commercial shoots, where they'll just shoot that plate, composite it in. It's really easy in Photoshop. You just do the lasso, you do shift and drag, and it will bring it on that next picture to exactly where it came from. Sometimes you don't even have to do anything. Make sense? Make sense, Kendra? Well, I assisted a lot of years, so I can tell you it's not heavy, but when the wind comes, it's a big sail. You know, I used to assist occasionally on catalog shoots in Florida, and you're on the beach holding this thing, your arms start shaking. And then if the wind takes it, you have to spin it so that it doesn't hit the person. It's...
Would you mind going through that once more, how you get rid of that?
Sure. So I was asked to go over, I'm just repeating for the folks at home. I was asked again how I did this. So here's the original shot. We've got our strobe. You can tell by the shadow that the strobe is to the right because the shadow on him is to the left. We have the assistant there holding the scrim, blocking out the sun. But obviously, she's not part of the final shot. So what we've done is the camera is on a tripod. So I take this picture, and then I take this picture, which is the picture I used. I take however many pictures I need, 50, 100, 300. I shoot a lot. Once the art director says, OK, we've got it, and I say, are you sure? Let's just do a couple more, just in case. Because there's nothing worse than thinking you have it and being wrong. Then I'll have the assistant move out and shoot a few frames with nothing there. But because the camera hasn't moved and the background hasn't moved, I can then in Photoshop take one of those frames and just circle where she wasn't and drop it in.
But he's in it still.
It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah. He doesn't have to be in it. Sometimes you'll take him out.
Probably for focus purposes, no?
Well, you lock down the focus too.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, you definitely, the focus can't change and the exposure can't change. If the focus changes, you're sunk. If the exposure changes, you might be able to compensate in post and fix it. But the exposure if all of a sudden the exposure shifts from him to that thing and back, it's going to stand out like a sore thumb. And Gaussian blur and lens blur aren't going to fix it. Yes?
So what happens if there's a cloud that comes?
Then I just wait. So if a cloud comes, what do? I just wait until it goes away. I am keeping an eye, like all this time if I'm doing this, I'm keeping an eye on the sky. And if I think clouds are coming that are going to stay, then we'll do that plate in the middle. I'll just have the assistant step out. We'll do a couple frames just to make sure it's there. You also have to be careful. If you take too long, the shadows will move. So if I do this, if I spend 4 hours on the shot and then do a plate and try and use a shot from the beginning and the plate at the end, that also is going to look different. So it has to be done fairly quickly. If it's a cloudy day, it's a different story, although I wouldn't need the scrim then, but maybe the light would be in there.
You can also do filling in Photoshop in case it's no portion.
Right, you could do content-aware fill in Photoshop. Something that's as complicated as this and as big as this is probably wouldn't work. But if it's just trees or grass or sky, you absolutely could do content-aware fill. It would probably work. When it works, it's magic. When it doesn't work, it's a disaster. But it works like 80% of the time. Or as they said in Anchorman, what, 50% of the time it works 100% of the time? All right. So because this is location, we're going to talk about finding a location. Who has a hard time finding locations? I do. It's hard to find good locations. One of the things I do is I just try and pay attention when I'm walking around, and I'll shoot pictures of things, and then I'll take a picture of the nearest street sign so I can find it later. But aside from that, here's some of the things I do. So Google Maps and Street View. Does everybody use Google Maps and Street View? If I wonder what the front of B&H looks like for a shoot, there it is. Looks like this at some point recently. We could probably look at the pictures in the window and tell exactly what was on sale. What was the specials this day? Is there a sign about closing for holidays? We'll know. So that could be really useful. And if you look at Google Maps and you click on Street View, you can see all those blue lines tell you where they have photographed for Street View. So you know where you can look. I mean, it's New York City. But what's interesting is if you look like in the Hudson River there between Roosevelt Island and the city, or in the East River, or in the Hudson just off, you can see there's a blue line in the water. It's because they did it from a boat. I found that out accidentally when I was looking for the next slide. I found one off Roosevelt Island that was in the water. You can see the boat in the foreground. But it really lets you figure out exactly what you want to do in a way that's a lot quicker than, I wonder if 59th and 8th, if Columbus Circle would be good. Let me go check. And then you just spent 3 hours of your day realizing that it's way too crowded. You don't want to bother. But with this, you can say, oh, I can just click on it and see and spin around. And pretty much all of New York looks like this. And then you can click. So I chose this because everybody in the world has done that shot of the bridge, right? If you go there in the summer on a weekend, there's like 15 people in the middle of the road ignoring the fact that there are cars there so they can get their shot. Frankly, I'm not sure why they haven't just closed that street to cars because, at least in the summer. If you go up Photoville, does anybody go to Photoville in September? If you go to during Photoville in September, which is in Dumbo, it's a nice photo festival, lots of exhibits and containers, shipping containers, you'll see like half the planet will be on the street trying to get the shot. And they'll all be in each other's shot. Like it's, oh. But anyway, I picked it because everybody does it. If you're like, where is this? This is how you can find it. Just don't do it during Photoville or during the summer on a weekend. I bet January at like 6 in the morning, you'd probably have it all to yourself.
I was there like not too long ago. I got there at 5 a.m. There were like 10 people there already.
All right, so he was there at 5 a.m. recently, and there were already 10 people.
I recommend 8
All right, he recommends 8 a.m. to 9 a.m.
Because people are heading to work.
Uh,
Not there.
so it's after the work people and before the tourists get up.
That's right. Tourists go out like at 10 or something.
So I would just say avoid weekends and go
Weekdays.
weekdays and not in the summer.
That's right.
There's also a neat place right around the corner that has a little park. You get the whole bridge there.
Right.
No building.
Yeah, it's this one. Everybody just likes that slot canyon effect. But yeah, the park. There's a lot of great places within 3 blocks of this that might have people, but nothing as bad as this is. But Google Street View, I know everybody said they use it, but none of us use it enough, I promise. And it's free. There's also, if you're willing to pay, there's sites like Peerspace and Splicer. I've used Peerspace. I haven't used Splicer. I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing it right. Which are sites, they're a little bit like Airbnb, but for locations. So Peerspace, I put in photo shoot in New York, August 29th, all day apparently. And all those little blue dots are locations that people have listed. And then on the right it shows you. So you could spend as little as $37 an hour for a bright and spacious loft in private, I'm going to guess, industrial area. Or on this page, there's something for $225, $39 an hour. There's a huge range of what's available. A lot of it's really expensive. A lot of it's aimed at like events where somebody's got $20,000 in budget. But you can find things besides studios, like that middle thing up there, creative prop room and psych wall. And I mean, it's got all that stuff. There's a lot of interesting locations. I've used it a lot in LA, where you might have, I rented a camper in LA that was in somebody's driveway and used that, the inside, and then used it as a background. I rented a house with a pool for $80 an hour for 4 hours. I mean, it's still money, but I don't know how I could get a pool for $80 an hour. Although when I got there, they'd forgot I was coming. They're like, you didn't confirm. I'm like, yes, I did. It was through Peerspace. She's like, oh, sorry. Anyway, it's worth considering. Is it the right choice for you? I don't know. It just depends on what your options are. For me, paying $50 or $75 an hour or whatever to get somewhere that's going to work for me, where I don't need to worry about getting a permit and where I don't have to try and convince someone to let me shoot there. New York is tricky because people know about locations here. Not always. Like I did do an editorial shoot where I just walked into a bar and said, hey, do you mind if we shoot here? And the bartender's like, that's fine. But you also walk into that bar and they're like, no, you got to talk to the owner. Or sure, it's $300 an hour or whatever, because they know that the TV show was paying $500 an hour. And the fact that it's you shooting for yourself or for an editorial client where the whole budget is $500 or $1,000 or whatever, people don't always understand those nuances. So with this, you can look for something where, yeah, it's a photo shoot, fine. We know what photo shoots are. It's good. I'm not endorsed by Peerspace, by the way. Splicer is the same thing. I just haven't used them. But it's basically like they're 2 Airbnb clones, but for locations. Splicer is the same. You can put in your budget. You say what you're doing. You can, with both of them, you can specify what you're looking for. So like on Peerspace, you can say, I'm looking for a pool, or I'm looking for a house, or I'm looking for a studio, or whatever. But you can get very specific. Of course, as you get specific, your options narrow. And sometimes your only option is that $500 an hour place. In which case, usually, it means I'm all of a sudden less picky.
And they only rent just the space, right? Equipment and all.
So the question is, what do they rent with the space? It depends. Some of the ones that are studios do include equipment.
Oh, okay.
And they'll say, typically, there will be a little thing in the listing that says what it includes. And it will say, if it includes equipment, it'll say. Although it's usually not that specific. Like it might say lighting equipment, I'm like, well, what does that mean? Does it mean a Dynalite pack from 1987? Or does it mean three B1Xs? I'd always bring my own stuff. Like if they have some stuff there, maybe I'll use it too. But I know my stuff works. I know what I have. I'm a little too paranoid to trust that whatever they have is the right stuff. But it will say, at least on PeerSpace it says. I imagine Splacer, you said you've used Splacer, Kendra?
Yeah, I have.
Does it list equipment if they have it too?
When we were looking for it, we were looking for like event spaces.
Okay, so it would be a different category. It wouldn't surprise me if they do the same because it would be silly not to. I mean, they're competing against one another. And that's such an easy thing to not let the other company, yeah. I'm sure if they don't, they will soon.
Yeah.
Because it would be foolish not to. But you can also filter by price. You can say what you're willing to pay, and it will show you just what's available there. So yeah, that's really worth considering. Then, of course, you got Instagram and Flickr, where you can search by geotags. Because I'm paranoid about copyright, because I'm a photographer, and I don't like people doing copyright infringement. I didn't do a screenshot of Instagram, but I did do one of Flickr after doing a Creative Commons license so that I could show all this. Even though you shouldn't do a Creative Commons license, because then people can use your work, and why would you want to do that? But you can say, this was a search for Times Square. Here are pictures from Times Square. Now I know what Times Square looks like. Do I want to shoot there? No, don't ever shoot. It's crazy. Don't shoot there. Shoot there at night when no one's there. Or in the snow. At night in the snow, Times Square is awesome. The rest of the time, oh. I'm sure we can all agree on that. Oof. But it's a way to get a sense of what's there that can be really useful. So anytime, Prospect Park, Central Park, Bethesda Fountain, anything you want, Battery Park, put it in and you can see what other people have done and it'll give you a sense. In some ways it's more useful than like Google Street View because you can see what people are trying to do creatively. In some ways it's less useful because you see what people are trying to do creatively and you don't necessarily get a sense of the whole space. And then lastly, if you have real money, the best thing to do is just hire a location scout. I just did a Google search for location scouts in New York City. I can't vouch for any of these people because I don't think I know them. I do know a couple who are good. A location scout is someone that you hire and you say, this is what I'm looking for, and then they find it. The really good location scouts have vast files of stuff, so they don't even necessarily have to go looking. You can say, I want a house with a 6-foot stone wall with ivy on it and a pool with a fountain. And they'll be like, OK, there's 6. Here they are. This is the owner's contact. Well, they would handle that. But this is what the owners charge. Or you could spend like 2 weeks driving around trying to find it yourself. Years ago when I was in Seattle assisting, there was a shoot we did where they did want like a 8-foot brick or stone wall with ivy growing on it with 2 or 3 trees on the other side, but other than that, just sky so that you wouldn't see the building. That's pretty specific. It's also something that is almost impossible to find in Seattle because there aren't walls with ivy in Seattle. So there were 3 of us. I was looking, another photo assistant was looking, and the photographer was looking, and we all looked for 3 days before anybody found anything. But if they just called the location scout might have already known. They're also good at dealing with owners, knowing what the insurance requirements are. So if it's a big project and you're shooting commercially, a location scout is the way to go. I would never, like a big ad job or something, I'm calling a location scout. I'm not messing around with that. It's a waste of my time. But there's a lot of jobs that aren't big ad jobs. And then I've got to waste my time because I still got to get the shot. Yes?
How about cities that have film commissions or tourist bureaus? Are they helpful at all? Or
Like photo permits. That depends on the city.
okay.
Some cities, like New York City has the mayor's office on film. Some of them are more helpful than others, but even the ones that are more helpful than others, a lot of it depends on who you talk to.
I used to live and work up in Boston, and Boston was pretty good in
So,
having
all right.
a free resource.
So Boston has a good one. New York's used to be better, but I think some of that's just because they changed the rules. There's certainly no reason not to call them, and you know if you're somewhere that has that department, call them and see. Yeah, I mean you call, somebody answers the phone, they're helpful or they're not. It took you 20 seconds to make the call. If they're helpful, it's worth it. If not, it costs you 20 seconds. You know, there's no reason not to try it. But it does vary dramatically between cities and municipalities, and some places don't have them at all. You also have some places where they're so catered towards film production, like TV, movies, that they're not really sure what to do with still photographers. And then they're just confused. And then they tell you things that aren't true because they're thinking production. So, for example, the New York City production requirements, permit requirements, apply. The rules are the same if you're a still shoot or a movie shoot. In the old days, the good old days, before I told people to get off my lawn, because that permitting process, you didn't need insurance for a still permit, but you did for a film permit. So if you were a TV show, you needed to have proof of insurance, but not as a still photographer. Now for New York City, to get that permit, you do need proof of insurance, $300 application fee, and then you go through that whole process. The application fee applies whether you get it or not. There's also some quirks. I'm told that if you're a TV show, which films 22 episodes a season over 8 months, that you can pull one New York City permit for that whole season. That's what I'm told, and I've seen it multiple places. Is it 100% true? I have no idea. But I've seen it more than once. I called them to ask if I could get a permit for portraits on the streets of New York over the next 6 months, and they said no. Then I said, what's the longest you would let me do it for? And they said a month. But if I could do a permit for $300 for 6 months, I would do that. But $300 for every shoot, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, it does if it's a big shoot, but it doesn't if you're shooting for yourself. Like I do a lot of shoots just for myself for fun. Hopefully we all do, right? And then those of us who work professionally, we have those too. But you know, there's an editorial client I have that it's $700. That's what their budget is. I can spend it however I want, but if I spend $300 on a permit, that leaves $400 for everything else, including me. So I'm not going to do it. I'm just not going to do it. But the New York City's website is very helpful. It's also helpful to know about this, so if you do get hassled, you can show it to someone. Because it says, if you're using a handheld camera, camera on tripod, handheld props, or handheld equipment, and not asserting exclusive use of city property, and not using weapons, you don't need a permit. So you could, in theory, have 20 people each holding a light, and your camera on a tripod. You don't need a permit as long as you're not blocking access to streets or sidewalks. As soon as you do put something on the ground, then you need a permit. And if you have people pretending to be cops, you have to get a permit, and you have to have an off-duty cop with you. If you have prop weapons, you know, but stuff like that's pretty straightforward. And frankly, I think even if that weren't the rule, you would be a fool in this day and age to have anything that looks like a cop or a prop weapon and not have a real cop there, so that when someone calls the cops, nobody gets shot. Getting shot is bad, except if it's by a camera. If you take nothing else from today, don't get shot. And don't have whoever you're photographing get shot either. That's also bad.
Sure it doesn't cover it.
Well, it might. I mean, I don't know. I imagine my liability insurance would cover that. But I'd rather not have to ever make a claim. I'm hoping to get through my whole career and at the end be like, yeah, I paid a lot of premiums for liability insurance. And boy, what a waste of money that was. That would be great. Totally fine with never needing it. So the New York City mayor, now it's the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment. In my head, it's still the Mayor's Office of Film because that's what it used to be called. They have a lot of information and they talk about what that means. And just knowing it has a lot of value. But we talked about Grand Central. And New York has some idiosyncrasies because you look and you're like, this is public property, it must be the city. It's not necessarily the city. Like we talked about, anything that's MTA is state property, like Grand Central. But Grand Central, filming and photography, all you do is send them an email. They have a little form in an email, you send it. You say, I would like to shoot, please. They say, what are you doing? Tell me more. And depending on what it is, they say yes or no. There's usually restrictions with Grand Central. Like I took, for a while I was teaching classes at FIT, I took a location class there with a permit. And they said, okay, you want to bring 20 people, do you? Okay. They have to be spread out. You can be in these 4 spots specifically. Only these 2 spots can have lights, and they can only have 1 light each. Because it's a big place with a lot of people. If you want to shoot at rush hour with a light, they're going to tell you no. I mean, maybe if you're like, you know, I've got $100,000 that says yes, maybe they'll find a way, but they're interested in safety. If you're shooting, they didn't charge me for that permit. I haven't found anything that says what the deal is, but I suspect if you're doing something that involves not making any money or very little money, they're flexible. If you say, I'm shooting for Coke and we need to bring 40 people, that probably involves some money. But then you can afford it. But in my dealings with them, they've been great. They are very hard on, it has to be at least a week ahead of time though. When I emailed them for that last time, they said, that's in 3 days. No way. I said, no, it's a week and 3 days. And they said, oh, okay, fine. So that week heads up is important. But it's nice to know that there are places that are flexible. I also have a friend who's gotten permits for Central Park, which is city property, but going through Central Park directly. And when they found out it was a still shoot and there was very little involved, they're like, oh, it's fine. But because he talked to them ahead of time and got the permissions, that's where if you just show up and start putting up lights, best case scenario, you get asked to move along. Worst case scenario, I don't know, I'm guessing a ticket, probably. I mean, I doubt they'd arrest you unless you were, I mean, I guess if you were creating a hazard. If they felt like you were dangerous, then you'd probably get more trouble. But I would suspect most of the time. Right. If you put a bunch of magic arms on the ground at trip height on all of the paths, then you might, be in more trouble. So that's Grand Central. I brought this up as an example. So then you have places like Los Angeles. Los Angeles, what I think of as Los Angeles is like 895,000 different towns, because Los Angeles is shaped like a deformed octopus or something, with other towns inside it, and like West Hollywood is a town that's encircled by Los Angeles. And Beverly Hills is its own town, which is also encircled by Los Angeles. Santa Monica is its town with Los Angeles north, south, and east of it. Like, it's bizarre. But most of the places, or many of the places, I shouldn't even say most, because I don't know. Many places in LA go through Film LA, which is a private service that is contracted by the city. LA has a very interesting thing, though. If you want to shoot on LA County property, and this is roughly it, because I could be wrong on the details. But LA County property with up to 5 people for still photography, you can get a permit that's good for a year for $100, which I think New York should do. So it limits what it is, and it's only LA County property, which is different than LA City property. But it allows you to get that permit for a year, and you just say, hey, I'm going to be shooting on Tuesday here, because they want a heads up. Part of the reason for permits sometimes is to make sure that you're not conflicting with something else. Like in New York, if you want to get a permit to shoot on January 30 or December 31st at 7 p.m. in Times Square, they're going to say no, because there's 6 million people there waiting for the ball to drop. And if you didn't know that and were just trying to shoot, that would be a hassle for you too. That's part of why permits exist. Part of it too is to make money for the city, depending on the city. But in LA, you can go through Film LA. I did have an experience where I tried to get that permit, and I went back and forth for 2 months with all the requirements, and then I still didn't have it when I went there.
And this is just to like shoot, so they don't have any specific requirements like handheld cameras?
So this is where things get tricky.
Right.
So the question is, what are the permits for shooting in LA? First of all, do not quote me on anywhere but New York, and then just quote the website, don't quote me.
Okay.
In my experience, almost everywhere in the country, theoretically, if it's a non-commercial shoot, you don't need a permit. To me, non-commercial means no one's making money, right? So I could have the best model in the world go taking pictures with 500 lights. If neither of us are making money, that's technically non-commercial, right? However, nobody else knows that. So if you go out there with a bunch of lights, even though it's non-commercial and theoretically you don't need a permit, LA will shut you down. I know people who've gotten shut down in LA all the time. It's a lot harder than here. I did have an experience shooting in LA in a park. I think it was when I tried to get that permit, and it took forever. Because they're like, oh, wait, no, you forgot this one thing. OK, here it is. Oh, wait, but there's this other thing. OK, here's this. Oh, wait, but what about this other? I'm like, can't you just tell me everything, and I'll just... I scouted. I found this park where you parked on the street, and then you went around a corner and up a hill, so you couldn't see it from the street. And I had a light, and I was doing pictures, and then somebody came to take out the trash. And it's like, do you have a permit? I'm like, no, it's a non-commercial shoot. It's like, doesn't look non-commercial to me. And so I'm like, well, nobody's making any money. I was really nice to him. And then he said, well, right here, this is county property. But if you go right over there, that's state property. And the state property I don't have anything to do with. So I moved 20 feet and kept shooting, and he was fine. So be nice to people. Like if someone says you have to move, don't argue with them. You can explain why you think you're right, if you think you're right. But don't tell them they're wrong necessarily. So, you know, my understanding, non-commercial shoot, I don't need a permit. And I've done other shoots in LA where I've, in other like random little towns where I've gone to the trouble of calling the city or the parks department, whoever, and then they're always confused as to why I'm calling. And then they're like, it's non-commercial? Yeah. No, you don't need a permit. I'm like, did I write down the name of whoever I talked to so if someone comes up? But do keep in mind, to anybody who doesn't know, it's the gear that makes it look commercial. It's not the reality.
I'm going to go to San Francisco, that's why I'm asking.
Yeah. And every city is different. So I would, in general, non-commercial, you don't need a permit. I can't say specifically for San Francisco or any other city because the rules, like New York, it doesn't matter if it's commercial or non-commercial. The gear is what matters. And they've made that very explicit. But I'm sure there's, you can Google it and there's somebody, there's 12 websites where somebody's arguing about it. But if you can find whatever the city says, or just call them. When I call just to get information about what I'm allowed to do, I don't ever give them my name or say what dates I'm looking at because I'm paranoid. Not, again, that I would advocate breaking any rules. Follow the rules. Follow any applicable laws. But you could probably call, I'm sure they have a city office for that. I mean, there's so many shoots in San Francisco. Just ask them. I mean, you can also sort of look, there's so many wedding photographers shooting in various places. And I promise you that almost none of them have permits, if any. Because it's just not, most wedding photographers just don't do it. And so if you see somewhere that there's 1 million wedding photos from, It's probably somewhere you can shoot. With yeah,
Right.
yeah. You may technically not be allowed to, but for whatever reason, there's tacit approval, probably. But it just depends. But yeah, always research anywhere. I will look it up for anywhere I'm going where it could be an issue, because you just don't know. And again, even in New York, even if you know, it doesn't mean you're not going to get stopped. And then sometimes you get stopped because you thought you were right and you were wrong. You thought you were on city property, but it turns out you're on state property. Or, there's a couple state, Gantry State Park in Long Island City is a state park. There's a state park in Williamsburg that has a nice view of the city. And so all those city rules are different for state parks. So it can be, and then some of them, Bryant Park is not a city park. It's privately done. So the rules are different. And yeah, it's confusing. Not as confusing as LA, where right now you're in LA and now you're in Santa Monica, now you're on county property, now you're on state property, now you're on city property. You get dizzy. All right. Thanks. Here's Sony's social, my social if you care. And now we can answer more questions if there are more questions. Yes.
Overpowering the sun.
Yes.
You kept advocating moving the f-stop.
Yeah.
Not a fan of high-speed sync?
So I'm not, and I'll tell you why. Because high-speed sync, you lose so much power that it rarely is a benefit. Because it's firing, you're either using hypersync like with Broncolor where it's the tail of the curve, so you're missing the most powerful part, or it's firing multiple times. Either way, you're losing power. And almost always, if you're in full sun, what you're losing in power doesn't make up for the increase in shutter speed. Does that make sense?
Could you do, well, yes it does, but could you do the same thing where you take 2 shots and mask out bring it closer so that you have the power?
Yeah, absolutely. That's partly why I showed that.
Right.
You could bring it closer so you have the power, just lock it on a tripod.
The ND filter, because you would be at you should have enough power then to overpower.
Potentially, yeah.
Depending on the strobe.
Depending on the strobe and the modifier. But yes, you could do that. Yes?
For photo walks.
Yep.
In New York, do you know if you need permits?
I've always operated under the assumption that you don't. I'm not going to say that definitively, but I don't know anyone who gets permits for that. I think it probably has to do with the size of the group and where you are. Like how big of a group are you thinking? I wouldn't worry about it. For the most part, you can make an argue that it's a First Amendment thing. You're creating art. Once it gets First Amendment, nobody wants to mess with you. That's why, you see people selling art and books on the street. They don't have vendor's licenses because it's First Amendment expression stuff. But I don't. There are places like we did a photo walk at Governor's Island for not depth of field, optic. That we got a permit for because Sony was there loaning equipment. We needed tables, we needed space. We're in that park on that island, they're like that. With that kind of thing, you're going to want to get a permit. If you're getting 10 people and walking around with cameras, the live stream's not on anymore, right? No, you're still going. Oh, am I? Check the rules. This is just what I think. I don't know for sure, but I think if you have 10 people and you're walking around with cameras, you're probably fine. What's that? Kendra says it's mostly true. It's some of it's going to depend on where you are and what you're doing.
If you have a bigger group, I'm just going by logic.
If you had 40 people, I would look into getting a permit.
They're all with cell phones.
I mean, some of it just gets into how much of an impact are you going to have on the people around you? If you are getting to the point where you're going to impact the public, you're probably going to need a permit. That's sort of my theory on it. If it's 2 people with cameras, you're not going to. If it's 40 people, you might. I'm sure that there's a city website that talks about it. Or when we're done, Kendra might be able to, because B&H has done that. You had a question?
Yeah, I do. It's actually quite interesting when you mentioned that you were photographing a lot of mayors of
Yep.
power. I wonder what's their budget and how do you
Very little.
contact it through them?
So the mayor's was a project I wanted to do
I see.
that I tried to figure out how to do for like 3 years. Because you can't just call up a mayor and say,
Oh, I should. Yeah.
you know, hey, I was thinking it would be cool to photograph a mayor. What do you say? I mean, you're never going to get through to the mayor and their people. It's their job to say no to that because there's no reason. So there's a magazine I shoot for occasionally that I realized that I was an idiot and I should have talked to them 3 years before. And I said, hey, I've got this idea to photograph mayors. And they said, great. And the budget was almost nothing. But it allowed me to get the access that I wanted to so I could do the project.
Because I know some, for example, in New York, they have a specific photographer that they pay by the hour. So I was just wondering, how did the connection actually happen and all that?
Well, that was through a magazine, and then the magazine calls. If you can get a publication to reach out, then they're mostly going to say yes, because it's good for them. In the city has photographers that they pay. You know, a friend of mine's a forensic photographer for the city. I'm sure the city council has a photographer. There's probably a photographer for the office of the mayor. You know, every city department, MTA has photographers. So those people are going to be the ones doing the just normal stuff. People like you or I, if we want to do it, we have to have a reason from a third party. Or you have to be so important and cool that they'll say yes. Like, I imagine if Mark Seliger called and said, hey, I want to photograph de Blasio, they might say yes to that because it's Mark Seliger or Annie Leibovitz. If I do, they're not going to return my call. Yes?
Yeah, quick question. Notice you never mentioned a light meter for your
Oh, I use a Gauss and Starlight too, yeah.
Okay. So you use, but trying to pick your brain and your thought process with getting the background. So you decide on how much you want in focus, like some of those.
Yep.
You do that, and then because you use Sony, you'll dial it in without the.
No, I'll meter everything. Because once you put
you
a,
meter the background as well?
yeah.
Okay.
But if it's full sun, I know it's
Right,
sunny
yeah.
16, so that I don't meter it. But if it's not, I'll meter everything.
And then you.
I'll meter the daylight, then I'll meter the strobe. Because do I want the strobe to match the daylight so it's just a hint of fill? So like the two, yeah, like that photo of the 2 police officers in front of the car,
Right.
there was strobe on that, but just a little.
Okay.
And then you saw others where there was a lot more. So it just depends on the effect I'm going for. But yes, I am a big believer in using a meter. It'll save you a lot of time.
Yes, it is.
Yes?
On those shoots that you're showing basically one image from each one of the shoots.
Yeah.
Are you usually hired to do like one picture?
No.
or-
No, not you. So Friday I'm shooting an author up in New Haven for a magazine called Poets and Writers. And they need 4 pictures. So in that situation, I'll figure out what the 4 pictures are. If I have the time and the budget to bring enough, I will bring enough things that all 4 shots are set up. And like if I'm photographing you, there's shot 1. We're done. I walk you over here. I just turn those lights on, turn these ones on. Shot 2, go over here, turn those lights off, turn these on. Shot 3, shot 4. If the budget allows for that and the time allows for me to bring enough gear to do that. If not, I'll still figure it out and then just move things as we go. But it's rare that the answer is 1 shot. Even if all they need is 1, I'll try and give them at least 2 options. Unless the client is there and can say definitively, yeah, this is exactly what we want. Because it's just hard to know.
Do you usually work with like an art director or?
I would say half the time I'm on a shoot, there's a photo editor and art director with me. And I would always prefer that someone from the client is there. Just because if I'm shooting commercially, it's my job to give them what they need. I'm there to solve a problem for them. And my interpretation of their problem may be different than the reality of their problem. So if they're there to say, yeah, this is kind of what we mean, but really what we mean is this, when they start seeing pictures, it's better. You don't always have that choice. I did an editorial shoot a couple months ago in Newark, New Jersey. Well, I was there for New Jersey Monthly Magazine. I was shooting on a weekend, and so the photo editor couldn't be there. So I shot my first couple of tests with the people I was photographing. I uploaded it to my phone because I can send it. Sony makes it easy to send it to your phone. And then I texted him, here's what we're doing. And then he said, looks great. But I'm going to do everything I can to communicate with the client to make sure that I'm not misunderstanding what they need. And sometimes clients communicate using words that mean different things to them than they mean to us. Like there was that little illustration going around Facebook for video where it was, here's the jib, goes up and down, here's roll, here's pan, here's tilt, and then, all these things, this is what they mean. And then the other side was, here's what the client means. And every one of those just said pan. Yeah, because to some clients, a pan just means the camera moves. But that's not what it means once you know more.
I guess I wanted to just do a follow-up to that same question. So I know that probably people call you nowadays to do education, publications in magazines and things like that. But how they originally started for you to get into the magazine's attention and then hiring you afterwards? So like for example, how a person who is just starting and is interested in doing magazines, how would you recommend the process in order to get to that level?
Well, there's a couple things. First, magazines are harder to get into than they used to be because there's fewer of them. Right. And everybody's budget is less, so there's less staff. So let me say that first. And then it just depends on the magazine. So I've got my website. I'm on a bunch of other websites. I send out postcards. I go to events where I meet people. I'll occasionally call people, although that doesn't work as well as it used to. I'll send emails, but that doesn't work as well as it used to. And then, so people will call me because they got a postcard or because they saw my name somewhere. And then some of it's referrals. But the referrals happen because you worked for somebody in the first place. It's hard to get a referral for that first one. But if you're looking at magazines, figure out what magazines make sense. Find out who their photo editors are. I use agency access, so I pay about $1,000 a year for a list of basically, I think it's like 25,000 creatives in the United States. It might actually be more. It's a lot. But most but not all magazines, most but not all ad agencies, a lot of companies, I can just look it up and it will tell me who the editors are. Say this is the photo editor, this is the photo director, this is the art director, graphic designer, because different magazines is different things. So I know who to contact. I used to try and do that myself. Like I'd go to Barnes & Noble and write down all the information from the masthead. But the turnover is so high that I'd build a list. I had a list of like 200, and like 20% of it was stale after 3 months. So it was so much effort to keep up with it that I would rather pay. And if the only thing you're interested in is editorial, I think it's around $1,000 a year, but for their full list. You can buy just magazines or just companies or just advertising agencies instead. You're not buying it, you're licensing the list for a year. And be careful if someone else has it, because they do put fake names in there so that you can, they seed it with fake names so that they know if you are allowing someone else to use your list. I know, I figured out who at least one of the fake companies is, so I don't waste the stamp on them in my list, but it's different for everybody, because that's how they know if you were to take my list and send all those cards, one of those is fake, and they would get that card, and then they would know it came from my list because they've got some algorithm to figure it out, and then I would get a phone call they would be like, what's up? I mean, you shouldn't do it anyway.
Right.
Just to be clear, you're paying for yourself. It's not, it's just like I buy a picture from you and then I give it to him. Like, that's not cool either. But, they do it just so you.
And the videos that you send is beyond the website and portfolio. Do you also send like a resume or editorials?
I send postcards mostly.
Okay. And those contain photographs of yours?
Yeah. So I use a company called Next Day Flyers. They'll print 1,000 5x7 postcards, 4-color front and back. For I think it's about $80.
Okay.
And then, I print out labels and put stamps on them and send them out. Sure. Any other questions?
Portraits. Let's say you have a block of time for 2 hours.
Yep.
How much of that time, and not necessarily a political portrait where there's a message to get across, or a commercial portrait, but more a personal portrait, do you really spend in getting to know the person, in establishing that dialogue?
So.
Or do you know that going in with phone interviews?
So I rarely have talked to the person ahead of time, unless that person is who hired me. And it varies so much by person. But do you mind stepping up? I'm gonna pretend I'm taking your picture. All right, so I'm gonna take your picture. Hi, I'm Tony.
Hey, I'm Scott.
Scott?
Yep.
Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you.
So I'm gonna take your picture,
Right.
right? I'm gonna take a ton of pictures. You can do anything you want, it doesn't matter. It's digital. Some of them are gonna be terrible, doesn't matter. Who cares? Nothing you can do is wrong. You wanna look that way, look that way. You wanna look this way, you look this way. If I want you to do something specific, I'll let you know. But whatever you do is fine.
Yeah.
And then, I didn't bring a camera with me, but where's the last place you went on vacation?
Seattle.
Seattle? What did you do in Seattle? How'd you like it?
Went to the top of the Space Needle and went to the public market.
Did you go to the restaurant on the top of the Space Needle that rotates?
Yeah.
How was the food?
Eh.
All right, but see right there? You see that laugh? I'm shooting the whole way through. I don't stop shooting. And in those situations where it's someone who's just a person, not that there's anything wrong with being a person. If it's an actor or a model or somebody who's used to being photographed, they tend to be more relaxed. But regular people, it's weird to get your picture taken, right? It's just a weird thing. So that's how I do it. Different people do it differently. But for me, that laugh, when I asked you how the food was, that was the shot.
That was the shot, yeah.
And the way to get it is to interact with you. So instead of getting to know you ahead of time, typically, I'll just talk to you the whole way through.
Gotcha. Good. Thanks.
Sure. But I do know people that'll be like, okay, look right here. All right, now, no, this way a little bit more. No, back.
Tilt the eye.
That drives me nuts. It's just, it works great for some people. I have friends who do it and they get great pictures. It just depends on what kind of photographer you are and what your goal is. For me, it's to get an authentic you. And that laugh was it. And there's no way I could have directed that laugh. It never, here, laugh. I mean, yeah. Then you're like,
How many shots or when would you start your workflow in terms of looking for that particular shot?
way after I'm sure I have it. If I'm doing, so the shoot on Friday, I'll probably shoot 800 or 1,000 pictures, maybe more. Digital, there's no reason not to shoot more, except that it's annoying to go through them later. But especially if I'm shooting in a way where I'm interacting like that, and I don't know yet on Friday if I will be, it just depends on the person. But there's a high incidence of bad pictures. Because in addition to getting that laugh, I'm also getting things where he just starts to say something and his mouth is like, that's not the picture. Or somebody blinks. So because there's a higher percentage of those, I have to shoot more so that I don't have those to pick from. But there's people, too, that'll go in and shoot 15 pictures. They're not good enough. To me, that's terrifying. Plus, let's say if you take 10 pictures, one of them is good, hypothetically, right? So that means if I have 20 pictures, 2 of them are good. If I have 100, 10 of them are good. Of those 10, one of them is still better. Maybe it was that first from the first 10, but there's a 90% chance it was one of the other batches at 10. And I'm interested in getting the best picture I can. But everybody's different. You don't have to do it whatever way works for you. That's what works for me.
Is there like a go-to post-processing workflow that you have, or do you even do post, or?
I do as little as possible. I use Capture One to process, and as little retouching as possible. I try and get everything in camera that I can. There are examples, like I showed with that lighting, where you have to do it in post. I'll sometimes boost the curve a little. I also do a custom profile. With X-Rite, you can make a custom profile for your camera, and I'll do a custom color profile. I don't, but I would if I weren't using all Sony glass. So usually within one manufacturer, they're pretty consistent with the coatings. If I was using third-party lenses, I would absolutely do it for each brand of glass, because the coatings, once you switch brands, the coatings can be very, very different. That said, if I'm doing something like a catalog, for every shot, I will build a new profile, because there the color is so important. For portraits, does it look good? Great. If the color is not exact, sometimes in fact you don't want exact perfect color. You might want to warm it up or make it a little different. But if I'm shooting and I need that burgundy red, more sort of red wine color of your shirt, it needs to look like that. So I will build a custom profile for that shot. And then when I shoot you again over here with that black shirt, I'm going to build another one. Yep. Yep. I use Capture One because for Sony files, I think it does a much better job. I also prefer the workflow. I think that it does a better job in general with files. But I will say, having said that I don't know, it just depends on what camera you shoot. With Sony, I think it absolutely is better. If you're shooting some other brand, you'd have to try it and see. But in general, I think it's better. Most professional photographers I know prefer Capture One. It's also better for tethering than Lightroom is. Although next month I'm doing a tethering, how to tether with Sony cameras in this very space. And I will cover Lightroom as well, because you have to do a weird workaround to tether with Sony with Lightroom. But yeah, I prefer Capture One. But I know people that prefer Lightroom. It's not one of those things that's an absolute. Whatever gives you the results that you like is right. I know somebody who uses On One. I mean, it just depends.
What was the software you said you used for doing custom color profiles?
So it's X-Rite. You need the X-Rite Color Checker Passport. Actually, any X-Rite Color Checker, but not the Passport Video. It now supports the SG chart, which has like 6 times as many colors, but that might be overkill if you're not me. But it's definitely a different profile. It's even more accurate. But the X-Rite Color Checker Passport. And it now supports ICC profiles, which you need for Capture One. I can get really nerdy. I've tried not to. Other questions? All right. There's no more to learn. That's it.
Good stuff. Thank you.
Thanks,